Dead Sea is surrounded by caves, climbed into the cave, and what did they find?
The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
For decades, it was believed that parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls were lost forever, too damaged, too fragmented, to ever be understood. But what if that assumption was wrong? Today, advanced systems like Grok AI are doing what human researchers couldn't, reconstructing ancient texts once thought completely unreadable. And as these hidden passages come back to life, they are raising unsettling questions about history, belief, and whether some knowledge was never meant to be uncovered. Into the Cave, a discovery buried in fear and time. In 2021, a team of archaeologists set out on a dangerous mission deep into the Judean desert. Their destination wasn't a typical excavation site. It was a remote cliffside cave that had remained largely untouched for decades. Reaching it required a vertical descent down a steep rock face, where one mistake could be fatal. This location was already known to history. Nicknamed the Cave of Horror, it earned the name from a grim past. During the Bar Kokhba revolt against Roman rule, a group of men, women, and children fled into this cave seeking refuge. Trapped by Roman forces above, they were left with no escape. Over time, they perished inside, leaving behind only their remains and the silence of their final moments. When modern archaeologists returned, they weren't just searching for artifacts. They were searching for answers hidden beneath layers of dust and history. And what they found, though small in size, carried enormous significance. Scattered across the cave floor were tiny fragments of parchment, darkened, brittle, and barely visible. At first glance, they looked like nothing more than debris, but closer inspection revealed faint traces of ink. These fragments were part of something far greater, pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls. On their own, they seemed insignificant, but when carefully examined and reconstructed, they began to form word and then sentences. Slowly, a voice from nearly 2,000 years ago started to return. The cave held more than just ancient texts. It preserved a snapshot of human life across thousands of years. Near the entrance, archaeologists uncovered the mummified remains of a child. The body had been carefully buried beneath stones, wrapped in cloth, and placed in a fetal position. Time had not erased this moment. It had frozen it. Analysis later revealed the remains were around 6,000 years old, far older than the scrolls themselves. Deeper inside the cave, another remarkable object was found, a woven basket in near-perfect condition. Dating back roughly 9,000 years, it is considered one of the oldest intact baskets ever discovered. Its craftsmanship revealed a time before pottery, when early human societies were just beginning to transition from hunting and gathering into settled agricultural life. These discoveries added context to the cave. It wasn't just a hiding place. It was a time capsule of human survival, adaptation, and memory. But the scroll fragments remained the most intriguing find.
The findings included ancient coins, a 6,000-year-old partially mummified skeleton of a child, and a weaving basket.
The Dead Sea Scrolls, first discovered in the 1940s, are among the most important archaeological finds in history. They include some of the oldest known copies of biblical texts, along with writings that provide insight into ancient Jewish communities, possibly the Essenes, though that remains debated. What made this new discovery different was not just the location, but the language. Unlike many earlier scrolls written in Hebrew or Aramaic, these newly uncovered fragments were written in Greek. That alone raised questions. Why Greek? Who was the intended audience? And why did the wording differ from known versions of similar texts? As researchers began piecing together roughly 80 fragments, they identified passages from the so-called minor prophets, including books like Nahum and Zechariah. But these weren't exact copies. They appeared to be variations, rewritten or adapted versions of familiar texts. That raised a deeper question: were these communities preserving scripture or reshaping it? Grok AI and the machine reconstruction of ancient texts. For decades, Reconstructing scroll fragments was a slow and delicate process. Scholars relied on visual matching, linguistic expertise, and educated guesswork. It could take years to assemble even a small portion of text. Now, that process has changed dramatically. Using advanced tools like Grok AI, researchers are analyzing these fragments in ways never before possible. High-resolution imaging techniques, infrared, ultraviolet, and multispectral scanning reveal ink traces invisible to the human eye. From there, AI systems take over. Instead of reading line by line, Grok AI processes thousands of fragments simultaneously. It identifies patterns in handwriting, spacing, and linguistic structure. It predicts missing sections. It compares fragments across different collections and time periods. In simple terms, it accomplishes in hours what once took years. More importantly, it does so without physically handling the fragile materials, reducing the risk of damage. This isn't about replacing human scholars. It's about expanding what's possible. And what Grok AI is uncovering isn't just clearer text, it's deeper complexity. Certain passages show subtle but important differences from previously known versions. Words are changed, phrases are rearranged, meanings shift slightly. These aren't random errors. They suggest intentional variation. Some lines emphasize judgment more strongly. Others alter tone or moral focus. In certain cases, wording that once seemed symbolic now appears more structured, almost as if it follows a deliberate pattern. This raises a difficult possibility that ancient texts were not fixed, but fluid, adapted over time by different communities with different interpretations. Among the reconstructed texts are passages that carry powerful themes. From the Book of Nahum, descriptions of destruction and divine power emerge. Imagery of a world shaken by judgment. From Zechariah, messages of rebuilding and moral responsibility appear, calls for fairness, honesty, and restraint. Individually, these ideas are not new, but in these fragments, they take on slightly different forms. The structure of sentences shifts. The emphasis changes. Certain words appear where they weren't expected. For historians, this is significant. It shows that even texts considered sacred were not immune to variation. It also complicates the idea of a single, original version. Instead, what we see is a living tradition, texts copied, translated, and interpreted across generations. Grok AI helps reveal these patterns by comparing fragments at scale. It can detect subtle consistencies across different scrolls, suggesting shared sources or shared editing processes. At the same time, it highlights differences that might otherwise go unnoticed. The result is a more detailed, but also more uncertain, understanding of these writings. Because the more we uncover, the less simple the story becomes. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this discovery isn't what was written. It's the possibility that some of it was intentionally hidden. These scrolls were not left in open libraries or temples. They were stored in remote caves, sealed away, and in some cases never meant to be retrieved. Why? There are many possible explanations. They may have been hidden for protection during times of conflict. They may have been considered too sacred for public use. Or they may have represented interpretations that differed from dominant beliefs. Whatever the reason, their survival was never guaranteed. And yet, here they are, resurfacing in a world equipped with technology powerful enough to reconstruct them. Grok AI doesn't assign meaning. It doesn't decide what is true or false, but it does remove one barrier: access. What was once unreadable is now visible. What was fragmented is now connected. And that creates a new challenge, not just for historians, but for anyone trying to understand the past. Because when ancient texts become clearer, they don't always become simpler. Sometimes they become more complicated and more uncomfortable. Decoding the invisible: how Grok AI rebuilt the fragments. Once the scroll fragments were scanned and digitized, the real transformation began. High-resolution imaging restored faint ink traces, but that was only the first step. Afterward, the data was fed into a deep learning system, one trained on thousands of ancient manuscripts, inscriptions, and historical writing samples. This is where tools like Grok AI begin to change everything. Instead of simply recognizing letters, the system began identifying patterns, handwriting styles, ink composition, parchment textures, and even the structural layout of scrolls. It wasn't just reading text, it was learning how the texts were created. Through this process, Grok AI uncovered something unexpected. The scrolls were not random collections of writing. Many of them shared distinct similarities: identical writing techniques, consistent formatting, and recurring material characteristics. These patterns pointed to organized production. In other words, the scrolls were likely produced in structured scribal environments, not by isolated individuals. Even in what seemed like remote or hidden communities, there was evidence of coordination. Texts were carefully copied, preserved, and distributed with intention. What once appeared fragmented and chaotic now revealed signs of planning and consistency. And in places where human researchers struggled to connect the dots, Grok AI filled the gaps. What emerged wasn't a story of scattered writings, but of a system. As analysis deepened, something even more remarkable began to surface. Beneath the words themselves, the scrolls revealed traces of the people who wrote them. Using multispectral imaging combined with machine learning, researchers began detecting patterns not just in language, but in movement. Subtle variations in ink flow, pressure, and stroke direction told a story beyond the text. It was as if the act of writing itself had been preserved. Grok AI could identify minute inconsistencies, slight tremors in lines, uneven spacing, shifts in rhythm. These weren't random flaws, they were physical signatures of human hands. Think about how handwriting today can reveal emotion, stress, urgency, hesitation. The same principle applied here, but across thousands of years. Each mark on the scroll carried a trace of the scribe's condition. One fragment, in particular, stood out. It came from a passage associated with the Book of Nahum. At first glance, the writing looked rushed and uneven. Letters appeared distorted, with inconsistent spacing and fading ink.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at an excavation site just south of Jerusalem. Archaeologists say those scrolls contain biblical texts.
But the AI analysis suggested something deeper. Micro-level variations indicated possible tremors, subtle, repeated inconsistencies that pointed to instability in the writer's hand. This raised questions that go beyond translation. Was the scribe ill, elderly, under stress? Or were they writing under pressure, perhaps hiding, perhaps racing against time? Suddenly, the scrolls were no longer just religious documents. They became moments of human experience captured in physical form. These were not just texts. They were acts of survival. For decades, scholars believed that the Dead Sea Scrolls were primarily produced by a single group, often identified as the Essenes living near Qumran. But as Grok AI analyzed broader data sets, that assumption began to unravel. By comparing handwriting styles, linguistic patterns, and material composition, the system identified subtle but consistent differences across fragments found in multiple locations. The scrolls were not confined to one site. Fragments discovered in areas such as Wadi Muraba'at and the Cave of Horror showed both similarities and distinctions. While some shared structural traits, others reflected regional variation in language and style. This pointed to a much larger picture. Rather than a single isolated sect, the scrolls may have been part of a wider network, multiple communities contributing to the preservation and transmission of texts. The languages alone tell this story. While many scrolls were written in Hebrew and Aramaic, others appeared in Greek and even Paleo-Hebrew, a script often reserved for sacred names. This diversity suggests that different audiences, traditions, and purposes were involved. Grok also detected evidence of revision. Some fragments contained corrections, rewritten lines, overwritten ink, and stitched sections that appeared hastily repaired. These weren't decorative edits. They looked urgent, almost improvised. It raised a compelling possibility. These texts may have been copied, edited, and transported during times of crisis, perhaps during the upheaval following the destruction of the Second Temple. Imagine what that would have required. Scribes working under pressure, individuals carrying scrolls across dangerous terrain, communities hiding texts in caves to protect them from destruction. What once seemed like scattered remnants now looks more like a coordinated effort to preserve knowledge at all costs. And through AI analysis, that hidden network is finally becoming visible. Missing texts and altered meanings, the gaps that stand out. As reconstruction efforts continued, another layer of complexity emerged. It wasn't just what was found, it was what was missing. Certain well-known biblical texts were noticeably absent from the recovered scrolls. Books like Esther and Chronicles, which hold significant roles in later traditions, were nowhere to be seen. This absence is difficult to ignore. Were these texts simply lost over time, or were they never included in this collection to begin with? Grok AI helped highlight patterns in these omissions. The gaps were not entirely random.
Found a way to unravel the mystery by using artificial intelligence to read the scrolls without opening them.
Some categories of texts appeared consistently underrepresented, suggesting the possibility of selective preservation. At the same time, the texts that were present showed variation. Some passages differed from known versions of the Septuagint and other early biblical traditions. Certain lines introduced unfamiliar phrasing or shifted emphasis in subtle but meaningful ways. In some cases, tone itself seemed to change. Passages that traditionally emphasized divine authority appeared softened. Others shifted toward collective responsibility, focusing more on community behavior than centralized command. This points to the possibility that different groups interpreted and adapted these writings based on their circumstances. Grok AI detected structured patterns in these variations. Changes in wording, syntax, and pacing weren't random errors. They followed identifiable trends, almost like different voices contributing to the same body of work over time. This challenges a long-held assumption. Instead of a single, fixed version of sacred text, what we see is a dynamic process, one shaped by multiple communities, each preserving what mattered most to them. The deeper researchers looked, the clearer one thing became. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not represent a single unified belief system. Instead, they reveal a collection of perspectives, sometimes aligned, sometimes conflicting. Some texts emphasize hope in a future messianic figure. Others focus on immediate survival and moral discipline. Certain writings prioritize ritual and law, while others lean toward communal ethics and shared responsibility. These differences are not minor. They suggest that ancient communities were actively interpreting, debating, and reshaping their understanding of faith. Grok AI's ability to compare thousands of fragments made these contrasts more visible. It could track how specific phrases evolved across different texts, revealing shifts in meaning over time. What emerges is not a static tradition, but a living one. Ideas were not simply passed down, they were adapted. In some cases, passages appear to have been intentionally modified. Messianic references are reduced or reworded. Apocalyptic warnings are emphasized. Moral instructions are reframed. This could reflect changing priorities during periods of instability. If communities were facing political collapse, displacement, or conflict, their texts may have evolved to address those realities. Rather than waiting for divine intervention, some groups may have focused on survival and cohesion. The scrolls, in this sense, become more than religious documents. They become records of how people responded to crisis. One of the most profound implications of these findings is the realization that sacred texts were not always fixed. The idea of a single, unchanging scripture does not fully align with the evidence found in the scrolls. Instead, what we see is a process. Texts were copied, translated, edited, and sometimes reinterpreted across generations. Different communities preserved different versions. Some emphasized certain teachings, while others adjusted them. Grok AI highlights this by aligning scroll fragments with other ancient sources, such as early Greek translations and later standardized texts. The differences are clear. Entire sections appear in one version but not another. Certain commandments are phrased differently. Narrative structures shift. These are not minor discrepancies. They point to a long history of development. This does not necessarily diminish the value of the texts. If anything, it reveals their resilience. They survived because people cared enough to preserve them, even if that meant adapting them. But it also raises difficult questions. Who decided which versions would become dominant, which texts would be included, and which would be left behind? Those decisions shaped the foundation of later religious traditions. And now, with AI-assisted analysis, we are beginning to see just how complex that process was. Rethinking Scripture: what the scrolls reveal today. As more fragments are carefully reconstructed and analyzed, the Dead Sea Scrolls continue to reveal a narrative far more complex than many once believed. Rather than presenting a single, fixed message preserved perfectly across time, these texts expose layers of interpretation, revision, and human influence. They reflect a process, not a finished product. With the help of Grok AI, patterns within the fragments have become clearer, showing how different communities may have shaped, adapted, and preserved teachings based on their own realities. Importantly, this does not point to hidden conspiracies or deliberate deception. Instead, it highlights something more grounded and more human. These writings were handled by individuals living through periods of instability, conflict, and cultural transition. Their world was not static, and neither were their beliefs. As they copied and passed down these texts, they made choices: what to emphasize, what to preserve, and perhaps what to leave behind. In doing so, they ensured survival of meaning, even if the form evolved. This makes the legacy of the scrolls both powerful and complicated. What has reached the present is not just sacred writing, but a record of human experience layered into every line. The scrolls are no longer just artifacts of belief. They are evidence of how belief itself is shaped over time. As more fragments are reconstructed, one thing becomes clear. Understanding these texts is not just about translation. It's about understanding the people behind them, their fears, their beliefs, and the world they were trying to survive in. The deeper we explore, the more we see that history is not fixed. It is shaped, interpreted, and rediscovered over time. Through tools like Grok AI, these ancient voices feel closer than ever, reminding us that the past was never as simple as we once believed. Outro. If this made you see history differently, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay curious. There's still so much hidden in the past, and we're only just beginning to uncover it.